Good morning, everybody. Dave Evans and Doc Vecchi here for SafeDefend Live. We're going to talk about a topic that's near and dear to my heart because I've had to live through this in my previous life. It's suicide awareness and prevention. It's a big thing that hits my previous life with military members. It's hard for kids. We just had one here in Oklahoma of a student. And it's an important thing for us as mentors, as parents, and just as good people to see the signs and reach out to help people. I had a friend, a very good friend, when I was in the military who lost one of his airmen to suicide, and it was devastating for all of us. So today we're going to talk with Doc Vecchi about some signs and ways you can help prevent and talk to the right people to get them the help they need, because we don't need somebody who makes a short-term decision, a mistake that becomes a permanent decision that ends their life. Doc, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Yeah, I'm sorry that you went through that. And I've also experienced it in my life. I think everyone probably has been touched by it.
Yep.
And there seems to be kind of an increase because as things get people lose their ability to cope and they get more in the crisis and the stresses of life and everything. But that becomes an issue. And I want to talk about suicide. I want to talk about awareness. Probably going to split this in a couple Safe Defend Live presentations because I don't want to shortchange this very important topic because there is some things that you can do in schools or workplaces as well as using these very same skill sets in your personal life, because suicide is not just um, connected to work or school. It's connected to someone who's in crisis, someone who can't cope anymore, someone who feels there's no help. And there's also, just a lot of myths about suicide. And I wanted to kind of start with that because if you base your suicide interventions or awareness or understanding of it on myths, just like with targeted violence, right? Then you're not going to be in the position to prevent it or even identify it accurately. And I think that's a good starting place as you talk about awareness. But what is it that are myths having to do with suicide? Well, one of the big myths is that people don't talk about it. So if you sense someone that you know is acting strange, is acting like they've given you the impression, even though it might not be direct, that they might want to hurt themselves or kill themselves or cause damage to themselves, you got to ask them. That's number one. That is probably the most important thing on suicide prevention is to ask. One of the myths that's out there is the fact that if somehow you ask them about the suicide, that's somehow going to encourage that person to commit suicide. And that is absolutely wrong. They are looking for help. Suicide is not a fun thing. It's a very desperate thing, but it's a problem-solving thing. We like to call it a permanent solution to a temporary problem
Yep.
type thing, right? And so when someone's contemplating suicide, that's the time to act. That's our window to try to help them and try to maybe reframe the subject and just be a lending ear for them, right? And I think that's probably, if people would understand that myth and understand that requires action, that's probably the number one thing people can do to move on to the ability to prevent this from someone and being that person that is there for them. The other thing that is a myth is that people who think about suicide have already made up their mind and they never seek help and don't want help. And that's absolutely wrong again. Um, they come to this point of suicide because they feel they're out of options. It's not a fun time. This isn't something that is enjoyable. This is a very desperate situation that these people are in that are committing this or thinking about it. Because here's the deal: if they never would seek help or care about help, then they would just kill themselves, right? So, the point that they haven't done it yet is the fact that they're trying to seek help.
Well,
Okay.
and here's a great example, Doc. A few years ago, I get a call at 4:30 in the morning, and the call goes something like this: "Sir, this is so and so, Captain so and so, just posted on Facebook that he's going to hurt himself." 4:30 in the morning. I'm like, got it. So my next call was to local police, and my next thing to do was get in the car and race like a bat out of hell to his house because he wasn't answering his phone. And I had the police with me to go in there and meet him immediately. He was asking for help. He had a gun. He was having a bad night with his spouse, but when I showed up, he goes, "Why are you here, sir?" And I go, "Did you post on Facebook that you were gonna hurt yourself?"
Yeah.
And he goes, "How did you find out?" I go, one of your teammates called me, and I don't want you to hurt yourself." And the police, we worked with him to get him out of the house, to get his guns away from him in a professional manner, and got him to a place where he could talk to somebody. So when you see those things, you can't just sit there and go, "Oh, it's whatever." That is a scream for, I need somebody to come keep me from doing something stupid. And my experience has been, if you look back on any suicide, you're going to see those steps and those times you could have stopped it, and you're going to regret it the rest of your life. You didn't say something.
That's a great example. Yeah, that's so true. Yeah, that is the bottom line. You sense it, because here's the deal: these people are screaming for help, as you said. If they have already decided to kill themselves and that was their final decision, they would just do it. And so people have to realize that there's a window of time from the time that you sense that there is a problem, that someone might hurt themselves or kill themselves, and if they are giving indications of that, that is the cry for help. The other myth that's common is that professional people don't kill themselves, right? They think it's someone who is maybe mentally ill, or
That is
someone
not true.
who is uneducated or
Nope.
is poor. It's not true. Suicide knows no bounds, knows no classes.
Nope.
In fact, people in the military and police are at the top of the list, right? But we're seeing this more, as far as when you talk about targeted violence, you talk about active killers, right? Many of these active killers totally expect that they're going to die in the process, and actually factor that in as part of their plan. The other thing is that is common is, if you do confront the person, or not confront them, when you talk to that person about the suicide, there's another myth in there that if their depression or their mood lifts, that is a good indication that you're doing a good job on the intervention. Okay. Well, that's typically not the case, because someone who is contemplating suicide is not going to suddenly change their viewpoint in a few seconds. What usually that means is that they finally made that decision to kill themselves. And so you have to be very wary about a uplifting mood, or a change in their mood. It gets better. They don't seem to be as depressed. The depression lifts, that is an indicator that they may have made up their mind. And so that's not the time to relax. That's the time to push through on the intervention. And I think the other one that's a myth out there is that it's spontaneous. It just happens without warning. And that is almost never true. Just like, I'm going to connect this to the targeted violence stuff that we've talked about for the active killer stuff, right? Active killings, active shooters, this violence, this death and violence in schools and workplace, is not a result of spontaneous activity or a snap effect. They go through specific stages. And likewise, suicide is not spontaneous or a snap effect. They also go through specific stages. And one of the things I'm looking at right now, which is I think fairly unique, I haven't heard a lot about this out there, but there is a lot of correlation between the targeted violence that we're used to talking about with the active killer and suicide. Okay. So, for example, and just to go after this point about this it not being spontaneous, and actually using essentially the same type of threat assessment approach with suicide people. So, if we're thinking about active killers, right, we know they have this pathway to violence. We've talked a lot about that. They start out with a grievance, and then it turns into a crisis. Then they decide that violent ideation and intent to commit a violent act, that becomes the answer, right? Then they research and they plan. and then they prepare and optimize, and then they do the attack. Well, if you think of suicide, I look at it as targeted violence that's just gauged or focused inward rather outward. Because if you look at the stages of suicide, you can put that right along that same pathway. So, for example, the suicide usually starts off as some sort of loss, maybe a grievance, being socially isolated. It might be feelings of hopelessness and guilt and social isolation, and whatever the reasons are, bring that person to the point that they become in crisis. So they can't cope, and they feel they have no social support, right? And when they did reach out, like in your example, and no one responds, they give up and they say, well, no one's there to help me. Well, then they at some point make a decision that it's so bad that violence becomes the answer. So anyone who's listening to Safe Defend Live, you're hearing me say the same things, but look at it in terms of suicide. The difference is that when you get to the violent ideation and intent phase, the violence is moved or turned inward instead of outward, and that's what makes it different than an active killer, right? So the suicidal person then decides that they want to commit suicide. So what do? They research and they plan. They write notes. They start giving away important things. They tell people to, watch my dog or take my dog, or, they make all these indicators of research and planning and preparation. Maybe they get the gun. Maybe they get the rope that they're going to hang themselves with, or whatever like this. And then they optimize, right? They'll test it. They'll do test cuts, right? Or kind of lean into the rope, right? To see what it's going to be like until they build up their courage. And then boom, now you got the attack, which is actually the suicide. And I think that if we start looking at threat assessment, in not just in terms of targeted violence outward, like active killers or active shooters, right? But the more, I think the thing that happens much more is suicide that has nothing to do with targeted violence as we've been talking about it, but the fact that they need help. People are suicidal, right? So in other words, if you look at a school and you look at the kids in school, you're going to have suicide as a huge threat. It's a huge risk compared to any of those kids becoming active shooters or active killers. Likewise, in the workplace, you have people that are in the workplace. Suicide is a much higher probability than a active shooter. Yet, the behavior, at least in my opinion, and based on my research that I'm doing right now, is exactly the same. So that whole pathway this pathway to violence that we focus on to deal with active killers and active shooters, right, can be used to deal with the much more prevalent problem in schools and workplaces, which happens to be the suicide. And I think that when you're talking about suicide awareness and you're talking about where do I start on this for an intervention, because the activity or the interventions are obviously much different than an active killer versus someone who's just suicidal, right? The interventions are certainly going to be a little bit different. There's going to be a different focus. There's a different mindset. I mean, they are different things, but the behavior and the assessment is very, very close. And I think that if we start looking at this pathway to violence and this threat assessment thing that we use for things that don't happen very often, but they have huge impact, which is the active killers, and you start using that same process, this gives teachers and superintendents and bosses and human resources brand new assessment tools to deal with a problem that is very common within businesses and schools. And so, as far as awareness, that's kind of what my thoughts are on that. I think it's kind of maybe a little bit different perspective, but I plan on moving forward with this to try to test it because I really think there's some value in it.
Yeah, I do too. If you're out there today, and I want to give you some action steps to take. If you're out there today and one of your family members or a student or somebody you know says, I'm going to hurt myself, I'm going to kill myself, here's what you do. You look at them and go, I just heard you say this. Are you okay? Let's go talk about it. Don't blow it off. Don't walk away from it. Don't say it's somebody else's problem. You may be the one person that keeps them from making the worst decision of their life. Trust me, I have lived through this. It is horrible to live through. It is horrible to even deal with. But you can be a positive influencer. You can save somebody's life if you're willing just to go, hey, look, that's pretty strong, man. Are you really going to do this? And do we need to go talk to somebody? Let's talk about what's going on. Why are you so upset? 9 times out of 10, that conversation allows them to relieve the pressure they're feeling for whatever happened and gives them an outlet to talk about what's going on and reduce the impact of that grievance or that challenge they're dealing with.
Yeah, and it gives a whole new meaning to see something, say something, really.
100%.
Yeah,
100%.
Yeah, well, yeah, and that's pretty much what I wanted to cover today. I just, trying to link it to the targeted violence stuff, which we're focused on, but also the fact that, suicide without the active killer element in it is much more of a problem in schools and workplaces. And frankly, the assessment, in my opinion, is going to be just about the same, with a few nuanced differences. And what I'd like to do maybe next time, maybe in the next 2, since this is such an important topic, is really start to drill down to what are the specific interventions that we can do to prevent this.
Perfect. Well, Doc, happy Friday, happy weekend. I will be at Parents Weekend with my son for the football game and hanging out all after this today. So you guys have fun. I know I will. With that, Doc and Dave, we are out of here.
Thank you.